They say that memory acts as a sieve, catching the gold and letting the silt wash away, but I have found the opposite to be true. The beautiful things, the way the afternoon light used to catch the dust motes in the upper gallery of the Radcliffe camera, turning them into suspended constellations of history, those are the things that have faded. I can barely recall the face of my thesis advisor, or the smell of the old vellum we studied with such reverent hands. But the silt remains. I can still taste the stale, metallic tang of the air in that cellar in Rouen. I can feel the dampness of the stone floor seeping through the soles of my shoes, a cold so specific, so malicious, that it felt less like temperature and more like a presence. It is 1942 in my mind, always. The rest is just a prologue I have forgotten how to read. I was 22, though I felt ancient, carrying the weight of a silence that was not natural to me. In Oxford, silence was a luxury, a space for thought to expand. In the cellar, silence was a predator. It was the sound of holding your breath until your lungs burned, waiting for the heavy tread of a boot on the pavement above to pass. The room smelled of boiled cabbage and old fear, a sour, human scent that no amount of scrubbing could remove from the walls. I sat at a table that wobbled if I leaned too hard on my left elbow, a splintered thing that had likely hosted family dinners before the world broke. My hands were the only part of me that seemed to know what they were doing. They moved with a mechanical precision that belonged to someone else, someone stronger. I was decoding a message from a courier we called Henry. I didn't know his real name. Names were dangerous, heavy things that could sink you if you tried to carry them. He was just a signature, a rhythm in the static. My pencil scratched against the paper, a harsh, dry sound in the damp room. I was translating chaos into order, turning jumbled letters into meaning, applying the rigorous logic of my linguistics training to the madness of war. It felt absurd, like trying to conjugate a verb while the building burned down. The message was short, routine, confirmation of a supply drop near the Seine. But as I transposed the letters, shifting the cipher 3 steps back, a cold knot tightened in my stomach. The syntax was wrong. Not glaringly so, a casual reader, even a German signals officer, might not have noticed. But Henry had a specific way of ending his clauses, a grammatical flourish that bordered on the archaic, a remnant of a classical education he must have had before the occupation. It was missing. The phrasing was too flat, too efficient. I stared at the paper until the letters began to swim. Was it just exhaustion? I hadn't slept in 2 days, fueled only by bad coffee and the adrenaline that came in sickening waves. Perhaps Henry was just tired. Perhaps he had been writing in a hurry, his hand shaking as mine was now. Or perhaps Henry was already gone. Perhaps the man tapping out this message was sitting in a comfortable chair at the Gestapo headquarters on the Rue de la République, a cigarette burning in the ashtray, smiling as he mimicked a dead man's voice. This was the fear that ate at me, more than the thought of death. Death was abstract, a philosophical concept I had debated in tutorials. Betrayal was intimate. It was the idea that my own mind, my own ability to discern patterns, would fail me. That I would lead the others, the baker, the port official, the terrifyingly young girl who ran messages on her bicycle, into a trap because I had misread a preposition. I rubbed my temples, the graphite smearing on my skin like a bruise. I wanted to be back in the library. I wanted to be arguing about the semantic shift in Middle English vowels. I did not want to be the arbiter of who lived and who died based on the cadence of a sentence. The radio in the corner, a bulky, temperamental beast disguised inside a battered suitcase, suddenly hissed. It wasn't the rhythmic tapping of Henry this time. It was the high-priority frequency, the line from London that we only used when the sky was about to fall. The sudden burst of static sounded like tearing silk. I scrambled for the headset, pressing the cups against my ears to shut out the drip of the leaking pipe, the distant, dull rumble of a truck engine shifting gears 2 streets over. The message came in fast, a stream of groups that my fingers struggled to keep up with. I didn't need to decode the whole thing to know the tone. It was an imperative, a command. I transcribed the groups, my heart hammering a frantic counter-rhythm against my ribs. When I applied the one-time pad, The letters resolved into a terrifying clarity. The pencil snapped in my hand. It wasn't a drill. It wasn't another week of watching and waiting and rotting in this cellar. The Dieppe Raid. The rumors had been swirling for weeks, whispered in the queues for bread, hinted at in the nervous glances of the resistance fighters. They were actually coming. The theoretical war was over. The real one, the one made of blood and iron, was arriving, and I was expected to be its eyes. I stood up, the chair scraping violently against the stone. I had to move. The safe house was no longer safe. It was a cage. I reached for my coat, a drab woolen thing that scratched my neck, and checked the pockets. Forged papers, a small mirror, a lipstick case that held a cyanide pill instead of rouge. My mentor was supposed to be the training I received in Scotland, the silent killing, the map reading, the radio operation. But as I buttoned the coat, I realized my true mentor was the thing I had brought with me from Oxford. My understanding of how people spoke, how they listened, and how they lied. I stepped out into the street, and the air of Rouen hit me like a physical blow. It was heavy with the scent of coal smoke and the river, but underneath that, there was the sharp electric smell of ozone. The city felt braced, like a body anticipating a blow. I kept my head down, adopting the gait of a tired student, a girl of no consequence rushing to a lecture that didn't exist. This was the performance. I had to become the mask. The streets were alive with a nervous energy. Field gray uniforms were everywhere. Clots of soldiers standing on street corners, their laughter too loud, their eyes scanning the faces of the passing civilians with a predatory boredom. I had to cross the threshold of the invisible barrier that separated the occupied from the occupiers. I had to walk among them, breathe their air, and smile. My destination was the harbor. I needed to see the patrol boats. I needed to know if they were priming the engines, if the leave for the sailors had been canceled. To do that, I needed to speak to the port official, a man named Luc who thought I was a sympathetic student from the Sorbonne named Marie, stranded by the partition. I found him near the customs shed, smoking a cigarette with a jerky, erratic motion. He looked pale. When he saw me, his eyes darted to the soldiers by the gate before settling on my face. I approached him, letting my shoulders slump, letting a tremor enter my hands. I spoke in French, but I pitched my vowels higher, rounding them out, softening the consonants. It was the accent of a frightened girl, innocent and overwhelmed. "Luke," I whispered, stepping into the shadow of the awning. "The soldiers. There are so many today." He exhaled a plume of blue smoke, his gaze lingering on my mouth. "Something is happening, Marie. They are recalling the harbor patrols. The E-boats are fueling." I feigned confusion, tilting my head. "But why? Is it the British? Who knows?" he muttered, flicking the cigarette away. "But you should not be here. Go home. Lock your door." I reached out, touching his arm lightly. The wool of his uniform was rough under my fingertips. I felt a surge of revulsion, a purely intellectual disgust at the deception, followed immediately by a rush of cold satisfaction. It was working. I was manipulating him, using his own protective instincts against him to extract the data London needed. "Thank you, Luke," I said, my voice trembling perfectly. "You are kind." I walked away, my heart rate slowing. I had the information. The E-boats were fueling. The German Navy was reacting. I had successfully lied, and the ease of it terrified me. I was losing the girl who cried over poetry in the quadrangle. I was becoming something sharp and hollow. Then the world ended. It didn't start with a sound. It started with a pressure, a sudden vacuum in the air that sucked the breath from my lungs. The sky over the coast, miles away, lit up with a strobe light flicker, silent for a split second before the sound caught up. A low, rolling thunder that vibrated through the cobblestones and up into my shin bones. The naval bombardment. Then came the sirens. They wound up slowly, a mournful, mechanical wail that climbed higher and higher until it merged into a single, screaming note of panic. The street erupted. Civilians scattered like dry leaves in a gale, clutching hats and children. The German soldiers shouted orders that were swallowed by the noise. I was frozen for a second. the sheer sensory overload short-circuiting my analytical mind. This was not the quiet shadow war of the cellar. This was the apocalypse. The ground shuddered as the first bombs fell on the coastal batteries, the concussions slapping against the buildings of Rouen. I had to get the message out. The radio was back at the safe house, but I had a secondary protocol. The baker, he had a transmitter hidden in the flour sacks. He was my lifeline if the primary location was compromised or if I was stuck in the city during a raid. I ran. I abandoned the shuffling gait of the student and ran with the desperate, lung-bursting speed of a hunted animal. I dodged a horse-drawn cart that had overturned, the horse screaming in terror, its hooves sparking on the stone. I ducked into an alleyway as a convoy of trucks roared past, filled with helmeted men clutching rifles, heading toward the coast. The bakery was on the corner of the Rue Saint-Trame. I skidded around the turn, my chest heaving, the taste of copper in my mouth. I looked for the sign. The protocol was simple. A round loaf of sourdough in the center of the display window meant it was safe to enter. A baguette meant wait. Nothing meant abort. I raised my binoculars, my hands shaking so badly I could barely focus the lenses. The window came into view. The shelf was empty. My stomach dropped, a sensation of vertigo more violent than the bombing. I adjusted the focus, desperate to see a crumb, a crust, anything, but the glass was clear. Then the door to the bakery opened. Two men stepped out. They were not wearing aprons. They wore long leather trench coats that seemed to absorb the light. They paused on the threshold, lighting cigarettes with calm, deliberate movements indifferent to the sirens wailing overhead. One of them laughed, a sharp barking sound, and patted the pocket of his coat. I lowered the binoculars, pressing my back against the rough brick of the alley wall. The baker was gone. The transmitter was gone. The city was locking down, the raid was beginning, and I was entirely, completely alone. There was no time to mourn the empty window. Grief is a variable that slows the equation, and I had to be efficient. I turned my collar up against the biting wind and vanished into the gray bleed of the street, moving toward the third contingency. It was a garret on the Rue de Robec, a cramped attic space I had rented under the guise of a seamstress. It was my inmost cave, the place where the student I used to be had stored her final exam. I bolted the door. My hands, usually so steady when turning the pages of a lexicon in the Bodleian, were trembling claws. I had to encode the coastal defense schematics. The radio was a heavy, blackened lump of metal in the corner, useless now without the crystals the baker was supposed to supply. I had to rely on the pencil, the paper, and the silk square sewn into the lining of my skirt. I sat at the rickety table. The wood was scarred with cigarette burns. I began to write. I reduced the complex geometry of the German gun emplacements into strings of innocuous poetry, using a cipher based on the structural syntax of Goethe, a bitter irony that the language of the enemy was the vessel for their destruction. Every stroke of the lead was a scream suppressed. Then, the vibration. It wasn't a knock. It was the shutter of the front door downstairs being driven inward. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with violence. Then came the boots, heavy iron-shod, rhythmic. They were not searching. They were ascending. They knew. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The network hadn't just been compromised. It had been surgically removed. Someone had sold us. I looked at the radio, my link to England, my tether to sanity. I couldn't take it. It was too heavy. I looked at my code books, the meticulous ledgers of a spy's life. They were too bulky. The footsteps reached the landing below. I grabbed the single sheet of encoded poetry and my pistol. I struck a match, dropping it onto the pile of code books and maps. The paper curled, blackening the logic of my mission turning to ash. I was burning the library. I was burning the student. I scrambled onto the chair and pushed open the skylight. The rain hit my face, cold and sharp. I hauled myself up, my fingernails tearing against the wet slate. Below me, the door to the garret splintered. There were shouts, guttural and angry, followed immediately by the percussive tier of submachine gun fire shredding the room I had just vacated. I was on the roof. I was no longer Evelyn Raid, candidate for a doctorate in linguistics. I was a rat in the rafters. I scrambled across the slick tiles, the slope terrifyingly steep. I could hear them below, spilling into the street, cordoning off the block. Spotlights swept the facades, bright white eyes searching for a flaw in the architecture. I slid down a drain pipe, the rusted metal biting into my palms, and dropped into a narrow alley behind the tannery. I ran. My lungs burned. I turned a corner and stopped dead. A patrol was entering the far end of the alley. 3 men, silhouettes against the gaslight. I spun around. Another patrol was blocking the retreat. I was trapped in a stone throat, and it was closing. To my left was a service entrance. The laundry. Through the grime-streaked window, I saw Madame Dufort. She was one of our emergency drops, a woman who knew nothing of the war, except that she washed shirts for men who sometimes left extra ration cards. She was pressing a tunic, steam rising around her gray hair. If I went through that door, I could escape through the laundry chutes to the river. But the patrol was 30 seconds away. If they saw me enter, they would storm the building. They would find the radio parts she unknowingly stored in the basement. They would find her. The patrol shouted. They hadn't seen me yet, but they were sweeping the shadows. I looked at a heavy cart stacked with wooden crates of lye and starch, standing outside the laundry doors. If I tipped it, the crash would draw them. The chaos would focus their attention on the laundry front. They would assume the fugitive was inside, or that the noise was a threat. They would storm the building. They would take Madame Dufort. And in that confusion, while they were killing an innocent washerwoman, I could slip into the storm drain on the right. The equation was simple. 1 life for the intelligence that could save thousands at Dieppe. A utilitarian calculus. The kind of logic we discussed in seminar rooms with sherry and biscuits. I looked at Madame Dufort's profile. She looked like my aunt. The boots were closer. I didn't breathe. I didn't cry. I stepped forward, jammed my shoulder against the cart, and shoved with everything I had left. The crash was deafening. Crates splintered, glass shattered. Dort, de Druben. The patrol opened fire on the laundry door before the dust even settled. I heard Madame Dufort scream, a sound that was cut short by the roar of the guns. I didn't look back. I pried the grate open and dropped into the sewer. I crawled through the filth, the darkness total, leaving the human being I used to be back on the cobblestones. I emerged 3 miles downstream, near the docks. The air smelled of salt and diesel. I was shivering, covered in muck, but I was alive. The city of Rouen was a glowing ember behind me, the fires of the raid painting the low clouds in frantic shades of orange. I made the rendezvous. I didn't use a dead drop. I walked straight up to a drunk German sailor by the quay, a man I knew was a courier for the resistance on the side, and pressed the damp, filth-encrusted poem into his hand. I held a knife to his ribs while I did it, my eyes dead and flat. He didn't ask for a code word. He saw the void in my face and simply nodded. I was exfiltrated 2 nights later on a fishing boat. I sat on the deck, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of cod, watching the coast of France disappear. I felt nothing. The cold wind didn't bite. The spray didn't chill. I was a hollow vessel, carrying a victory that tasted like ash. Decades have passed. The silence of the Bodleian Library is different from the silence of a safe house. It is the silence of preservation, not anticipation. I sit here at my reserved desk, the oak polished by generations of scholars. The light filters through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Students pass by. They are young, vibrant, full of passionate theories about justice and morality. They argue in hushed tones about the ethics of intervention, about the sanctity of life. I listen to them and I envy them their certainty. They believe that logic is a clean line, that the world can be parsed and understood through the rigors of intellect. I cannot sit with my back to the door. Even here in the heart of civilization, amidst the smell of old paper and leather binding, I position my chair in the corner. I watch the librarian stamp books. I watch the way a young man hands a pen to a young woman. I deconstruct their micro-expressions. Is he nervous? Is she lying? What is the leverage? The war ended for the world in 1945. It never ended for me. The treaty was signed, the parades were marched, but the wiring in my brain had been resoldered by adrenaline and guilt. I won the battle for my country, but I lost the peace of an unguarded mind. I look down at the book in front of me. It is a history of the Second World War. Chapter 6 discusses the intelligence coup that preceded the Dieppe Raid. It mentions heroic agents and masterful deception. It does not mention a laundry cart. It does not mention Madame Dufort. I went to war to protect the world of ideas, of open debate and trust. I fought to preserve the sanctity of the university, the freedom of the mind. But to win, I had to become a creature of suspicion and deceit. I had to murder the truth to save it. The great lesson, the elixir I brought back from the underworld, is that victory is never clean. We buy our freedom with the currency of our own innocence. We trade our souls so that others can have the luxury of having one. The machine of my mind, one so perfectly tuned for linguistics and syntax, is broken. The gears grind on the grit of memory. The harvest of my youth was ruined in that alleyway, trampled into the mud so that the field could be saved for others. I am a guardian of a temple I can no longer enter. So when you hear stories of war, don't just count the dead. Count the ghosts they left behind, the ideals they were forced to sacrifice. That is the only way to truly understand the cost. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.